Timbuktu, the remotest place on earth. Or so the story goes. The word has become so deeply embedded into the modern imagination, yet few people even know where Timbuktu actually is. Timbuktu is in Mali, at the foot of the Saharan desert. 5 centuries ago, the city was a bustling center of commerce. Caravans crossed the desert, leaving Timbuktu with slaves, ivory, and gold, and returned with cheap European goods, silk and amber. High profits created an atmosphere for learning, which led to a small renaissance. The city attracted holy men and scholars, and soon had its own university. Europe learned of Timbuktu through an Arab traveler named Leo Africanus, whose travel journal in 1526 set European imaginations ablaze. Leo Africanus may have visited the city at its peak, but he probably also exaggerated what he saw. Later travelers looked at Timbuktu with a more jaded eye, but in Europe their accounts were ignored. Some were labeled as impostors. Timbuktu had become a legend, and the legend wasn't going to die with a few bad reports. Timbuktu's star began to wane with the arrival of the Portuguese along the West African coast in the 15th century. Alternative trade routes utilized the sea instead of the desert, and Timbuktu gradually went into decline. Timbuktu today is a city of mud brick houses, sandy back streets, and Tuareg camel herders. Temperatures can climb to as high as 110 degrees Fahrenheit for as much as 8 months per year. The city boasts 2 hotels, a mosque, a post office, and a number of ancient mansions. Automobile traffic is light, and it's sometimes hard to tell the highway from the desert. Large camel herds are occasionally spotted, but the legendary salt caravans are down to 1 per week, and the desert encroaches, about 1 mile per year. While Timbuktu has more than its share of characters looking for easy opportunities, most locals just go about their business, pumping water, carrying produce to market, or seeking out the latest news in the city square. One resident of Timbuktu is Isam Ibrahim, a 14-year-old camel driver who speaks 5 languages.
I speak 5 languages.
What are they?
Songhai, Tamashek, and English, and French, and small Japanese.
And you're a camel driver?
Yes, I'm camel driver.
Tell us a little bit about your life.
I live for desert. Yes.
And what do you enjoy doing?
Me, I do take the caravan of the soul.
And how do you feel about Timbuktu?
Why?
Do you like Timbuktu?
Yes, I like Timbuktu because it's very nice.
And what do you like about it?
And
What do you like about Timbuktu best?
and I like desert. I finished because it's all what I see. Timbuktu and desert is all what I see.
That's all you see, huh?
Yeah.
And how did you learn all these languages?
Huh?
How did you learn so many languages?
Me, I'm learning here.
But how did you learn English? You told me you didn't go to school,
No, I forgot school.
and yet you learned 5 languages.
Yes, and I speak with a friend, like you.
You learned from people like me?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Timbuktu still retains its aura, but as one recent visitor remarked, the reason authorities can charge an entry fee to Timbuktu is that they know no one would ever come back here twice. Timbuktu is a legend. It's a small piece of a story that for millions of West Africans is all too real. Westerners may continue associating West Africa with a multiplicity of things which may or may not be a part of everyday life. Voodoo, tribal masks, certain musical styles, and even wildlife, much more plentiful in East and South Africa than in West. But West Africa is much more than all of these things. The region will never fit comfortably onto one painter's palette. Its history, languages, and lifestyles are varied, complex, and jarring to the modern imagination. The surfaces of West Africa can only be scratched. They would take a lifetime to uncover. West Africa could loosely be described as 14 countries extending from Mauritania and Senegal in the northwest to Mali, a country 3 times the size of France, in the north-central region, to Niger and Nigeria to the east and south, respectively. Countries like Togo, Benin, Ghana, and the Ivory Coast form the southernmost border of the region, their lagoons stretching for hundreds of kilometers along the Atlantic coast. The region has a Middle Eastern tilt to it, located as it is just south of the Saharan Desert, and the influence of Islam is fairly universal. Traditional beliefs and animism hold sway in many regions, while the influence of Christianity is considerable and growing. While official languages can range from English and Arabic to Portuguese, West Africa's lingua franca is generally French, with a mind-numbing variety of local languages backing it up. The region is a turbulent one. 2 countries in particular, Liberia and Sierra Leone, have suffered debilitating civil wars for over 30 years. And while countries like Ghana and Senegal seem relatively stable by African standards, the volatility of African politics remains a constant. Many parts of West Africa are being deforested at an alarming rate, and in a country like Burkina Faso, over 90% of the country's energy is supplied by firewood. While most national currencies are worthless beyond the borders of each country, 13 French-speaking countries in West Africa use the CFA, a currency backed by France. Among West Africa's most prominent countries are oil-rich Nigeria, exotic Mali, former home of the great Malian Empire, and Ghana, Africa's first independent nation, formerly called the Gold Coast. The region has also produced its share of musicians like Fela Kuti and Ali Farka Touré, and writers like Wally Soyinka and Ben Okri. While most would wish that the slave trade had never happened, the fact remains that between 12 and 20 million Africans were taken from their homelands between 1665 and 1807 and displaced overseas. The history has etched a permanent mark upon the region's psyche. Slavery had already been an African institution for over 2 centuries, but England, France, Portugal, and the U.S. all openly embraced it. Rich in culture and popular tradition, Africa is the most linguistically complex continent in the world, the country of Nigeria alone having 250 different ethnicities and over 100 separate languages. From the deserts of Mauritania to the forests of Côte d'Ivoire, from Burkina Faso, where the life expectancy is only 33, to Gabon, where the great Albert Schweitzer set up shop, West Africa tells its own tale on a frequency very few would tune into. It isn't the best known part of the world, but this also goes a long way in explaining what makes it so interesting. The River Niger is the 10th largest river in the world. Once referred to as England's highway into Africa, it might also have been called France's. The Niger flows 2,600 miles through 4 countries, originating near the border of Guinea and Sierra Leone, then weaving its way through Mali to the Sahara Desert, before moving southward through Nigeria and Cameroon. The flow of the Niger has fascinated everyone from the geographer Ptolemy to the historian Herodotus. It was also, unfortunately, a graveyard for many of Europe's early explorers. Adventurers like Mungo Park, Hugh Clapperton, and Gordon Lang were men of courage, refined technical skill, and uncommon perseverance. Yet one by one they perished along the Niger, felled by malaria, Arab traders, or hostile African chiefs. The details were usually sketchy, and in one case more than a half-century passed before an accurate report emerged. Great rivers are sometimes said to have an epic feel, yet the River Niger has more of a pared-down feeling than a grandiose one. Wide open spaces are the rule. The landscape is dotted by small villages, sparse vegetation, and semi-nomadic shepherds. In places, the river is 4 miles wide, and water levels, depending upon the season, can vary by as much as 35 feet. Hollowed-out logs called pirogues provide simple river transport, while the larger panache takes on the heavier work. Passengers on these boats are given 1 sack of millet as their sleeping quarters. The sack is usually shared by 3 people who get to know each other quite well. Some boats are so overloaded that they capsize. Recently, one such incident killed 14 people. Inquiries about the details of such matters are commonly met with either feigned ignorance or denial. Mali's largest river port, Mopti, is as good a place as any to investigate the Niger. An intense West African city, Mopti is the hub of river activity in Mali, and the action never seems to stop. Just outside the Côte d'Ivoire city of Man lies a mountain village called AcirfatseW. Villagers here work from dawn to dusk, preparing food, planting crops, hoeing, or making mud bricks. The lifeblood of AcirfatseW is coffee and cocoa, both harvested locally, then supplied to buyers in Abidjan. The Ivory Coast is the world's leader in cocoa exports, and a drop in world prices can be devastating. The village has its share of eccentrics. The village chief, an excitable man named Matthias, illustrates the point. He is quick to agitate and a little overly fond of his palm wine. Many African villages expect payment from visitors, and this was the source of some tension in AcirfatseW. It filtered down from Matthias to his sons, and it probably wasn't such a bad idea to leave. 250 miles to the north of AcirfatseW lies the Malian village of Manankoro. Residents wheel goods and produce to the daily market at the north side of the village or to the informal bus station just to the south. Men huddle around small food stalls in the early morning chill, drinking coffee or tea and eating omelets and French bread. In Ganvier, Benin, 25,000 villagers live without electricity in a remote lakeside fishing village founded in the early 1700s. Most of the village's buildings are propped up by wooden stilts. The village has 1 hotel, 1 post office, and it takes about 2 hours to paddle out to it from the mainland. Ganvier's villagers are harvesters of fish as much as fishermen per se. Ranches are planted beneath the village's buildings, and the decomposing leaves then attract fish. Fishing nets are strategically placed, and the daily catch is then shipped out to the mainland or to Benin's capital city, Cotonou. Sanitation in Ganvier is an afterthought. In Saint Louis, Senegal, a fishing fleet 200 boats strong returns to shore each evening at twilight, only to take to the waters again early each morning. Their brightly colored patterns are reminiscent of upside-down totem poles. Islamic fishermen along the coast even have their own cemetery, with fishing nets thrown over the top of their tombstones. Ghana too has its great fishing towns. Sandwiched between Elmina and Cape Coast lies a 4-kilometer stretch of historical forts, former trading posts, and slave depots built by the Portuguese, the British, and amazingly, even the Swedes. Ghana at one time had 37 such forts, some of which held as many as 2,000 slaves. While mythologist Joseph Campbell's work doesn't seem to have included the Dogon of West Africa, it easily could have. This colorful and mysterious group nicely illustrates many of Campbell's theories. Dogon stories incorporate everything from the Prometheus myth to the Big Bang theory, arrived at hundreds of years ago on a vast tract of West African desert. An agricultural people who grow onions, maize, and tobacco, the Dogon have for 500 years built settlements along an escarpment 120 miles long from northeastern Mali to Burkina Faso. Their predecessors were an earlier group of cave dwellers called the Telem. The Dogon moved into structures the Telem carved in a rock face as high as 1,000 feet above ground. But as the semi-arid desert below has gradually been cleared, the Dogon have come down from the mountain, resettling at ground level only about 30 years ago. Originally animists, the Dogon adopted Islam as a protest against French Christianity. Today, the worship of ancestors and spirits coexists with both, all three often represented within the same village. Well tuned to the stars and their movements, the Dogon have long regarded the star Sirius to be 3 separate entities, 2 stars and a third invisible area. Modern astronomers have always regarded Sirius to be 2 stars until 1995, when powerful modern telescopes revealed a third area of dense material. The Dogon also knew that it takes 60 years for Sirius's B star to orbit its smaller A star. They have celebrated this with a renewal ceremony every 60 years. A German doctor visiting Mali for the first time called these villages the greatest sight in the world, and to an untrained eye, they may also appear to be the least altered. But an associate of anthropologist Marcel Griot, who did the original groundbreaking work on the Dogon, recently returned after a 50-year hiatus. He was distressed. Even the youngest villagers asked for pens, cent francs, un cadeau, or anything offered. Traditional costumes now compete with athletic wear, and self-esteem has taken a back seat to economic expediency. It's true that the Dogon have been forced to change, first due to colonialism and later technology and tourism. In the long term, more dramatic changes may lie ahead. But for the moment, there are probably few places on Earth where a people has maintained such a unique culture in such an unbroken line. Perhaps this alone must be cause for quiet admiration. Dominated as it is by rural agriculture, it's easy to forget that West Africa is also a region of lively cities, some as small as Lomé, Togo, others as daunting as Lagos, Nigeria. Anthropologist Richard Leakey once remarked that there was very little architecture in Africa and that African cities paid the price. He has a point. In some of Africa's smaller cities, the most notable structure is a water tower or perhaps a train station. Other times, it might be a mosque or a Christian church. A city like Bamako, Mali, for example, is a mix of both. A city of only modest architectural charm, Bamako is a pedestrian's nightmare and a pickpocket's dream. Traffic moves along relentlessly, and anyone on foot is forced to maneuver into ever-tightening circles. People might say it's like something out of Dickens, but even Charles Dickens would have had a hard time imagining Bamako. Lepers and polio victims saunter along the main streets as beggars and street hawkers hit the small cafes. A donor scraping together change for 3 beggars is suddenly surrounded by 12. Everyone is needy, and people's needs are worn upon their sleeve. A good 40 hours from Bamako, on the so-called horror train of West Africa, is the Senegalese capital of Dakar. Dakar is a vital seaport and a major gateway to Africa from Europe. For some, the city is a Western-styled sanctuary. The tree-lined Place de l'Indépendance offers up hotels that wouldn't be out of place in Hong Kong or Mexico City. Dakar's traffic jams rival those of Rome or Bangkok. Fashionable Senegalese women dress in traditional African garb or as though they had just stepped off the curb along the Champs-Élysées. Street hawkers turn up the heat, selling everything from colorful clothes to reading glasses, from shoe shines to out-of-tune koras. For almost anyone, the price of an item can be brought down threefold in a matter of seconds. Idealists only see Dakar's Western sophistication. Romantics may think they're in Saigon, 1950. But Dakar is also a city replete with African realities. Sure, bright Senegalese faces convey a certain sense of optimism, but it's an optimism tempered by a laundry list of poor prospects. A French visitor recently remarked, "Everyone in Europe knows about Dakar. It's a desirable destination. But once you get there, you want to leave. The outer surface of Dakar shines like a '48 Buick. But take away the French food, the posh hotels, and the rooftop pools, and one is back in Bamako. Like so much of the world's landscape, urban populations in West Africa have exploded as rural villagers have flooded into cities by the thousands in search of a better life. Whether the promises are fulfilled is another matter. African cities can be terribly unsettling places, and the pace could wear almost anyone out. Perhaps this is why everyone seems to be so young. Another West African capital is Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, a metropolis of 3.5 million people. Sometimes referred to as the Paris of West Africa, Abidjan is a city of skyscrapers, colorful markets, and tree-lined boulevards. On any given morning, marketeers scurry past Lebanese money changers as sidewalk barbers cut the hair of businessmen reading Le Monde. While its outlying neighborhoods can be pretty rough, the central city's restaurants and elegant shops wouldn't be out of place in Martinique or Marseille. Abidjan, in fact, bears a certain resemblance to Boston from the highway coming in. French expatriates flock to nearby beaches on the weekend, escaping a capital city that, along with Lagos and Dakar, makes a person think twice about strolling around alone at odd hours. Two Canadians recently started a color copying business in Bamako. After the obligatory payoffs to government officials, they opened up shop. Who can afford color copies in West Africa? Maybe the patrons of Frankie's restaurant in Ghana, expatriates, tourists, middle-class locals. It's a small portion of the public at large, but it's the same segment that keeps all such businesses afloat, whether it be theater on a larger scale or just Indian restaurants on the smaller one. An irate talk show caller in Ghana complains, "Our problem is that we are lazy." But Africans surely seem pretty active and industrious everywhere one looks. In Burkina Faso, formerly called Upper Volta, young men with no occupations at all sit around by the score, looking completely bewildered. A young man with a jewelry stand might not sell anything all week. It's a wonder things don't explode. At Ghana's border with Togo, a man collects travelers' passports and cheerfully fills out customs forms. He isn't even an official. He's only a hanger-on, hoping that some small tip will result. An Irish tourist crossing Senegal by train throws an empty water bottle out the window as trash. Two African men go for it at once and end up having a fist fight. The examples are endless. The needs are so great and the opportunities so small. Jerome Touré, a custodian in a Dakar hotel, works 7 days a week. One would like to think he derives some benefit from his work. He claims, however, that the hotel owners often don't pay him at all.
Everything is difficult. Electricity, schooling, rent, we suffer a lot. It's very hard for one person in charge of a whole family. We have no choices, no other solutions but to work hard. It's been like this for 20 years. I have to do this for the whole family.
Keeping professional people happy can be a problem. Nurses in Ghana, for example, are paid a pittance. After only a few years on the job, they move on to any place where they might be better paid. Talented professionals evacuate, and the African community loses out. The tale is all too familiar. West Africa's younger people hold out more hope for the future. At Ghana's School of Journalism, Nelly Akweli-Abi and Juno Turkson are in the first year of a 2-year study program. They are bright, thoughtful, and idealistic, and hope to make a difference in their chosen field.
I hope to make a difference in my country. I like to be able to do things for my country that my country will develop in future. And besides, I like my life personally to be a life of fulfillment, a life that I have achieved the things I want in life, a life that I will live comfortably with everything that I need and not worry about tomorrow and what might come.
I'm a journalist, and if I have to go to other African countries to help in changing the hardship or the, the bad things, I don't have to hesitate. I still have to do it.
Obo Dioulasso, Ouagadougou, Cotonou, Laba Congo, Gorom Gorom. An endless string of hot, dusty, godforsaken towns, a string of backwaters with one-crop economies. Broken down engines and blast furnace heat. Hotel rooms lit by candles after the electricity is blown. Buses full of children and goats, the only comfortable seat claimed by the latter. But it's on the back roads and byways that the pulse of West Africa can be found. In Mali, Tuareg camel herders refuse to show their faces to anyone of higher status. In the Ivory Coast, one hears stories about the child jugglers. They aren't children who juggle, they're grown-ups who juggle children. West Africa is a region of extremes. The difference between a diplomat in Dakar and a shepherd in Mauritania could be as great as that between a Japanese sumo wrestler and an Australian travel agent. A Dutch tourist named Tim praises the beauty of Malian dress, finds disorganization in all aspects of Malian life, and calls Malians the most patient people I've ever seen in my life. While Westerners struggle with African languages, Africans struggle with European languages. Recently, when asked where one could buy French bread in the neighborhood, an African butcher motioned with his left arm and said, "Right around the corner, 200 miles." Local languages and the lingua franca sometimes collide in funny ways. One morning on a bus in Ghana, a humorous story was told on the radio about 4 thieves who had stolen a cellular phone. When the owner of the phone called his own number, the thieves answered and were eventually caught. The story was broadcast in the national language of English, and no one on the bus reacted. Several minutes later, the same story was repeated in the local language of Twi, and everyone on the bus went into hysterics. Africa's rules and regulations are so arcane they can make a visitor dizzy. Simple hotel receipts look like something left over from a bank loan. Airplanes can take 4 or even 5 hours to load up. Buses scheduled to leave at 6 in the morning might show up at 4 in the afternoon. Embassies and consulates request more photos than the FBI. Expatriates and travelers are left fuming, yet Africans barely shrug. Kodugu, Sikasso, Yakuba, Dahomey, Kumasi, Sassandra, Korhogo, Sekonde. The Cape Verde Islands nestle 250 miles off the coast of West Africa, like a quiet harbor waiting out a typhoon. With the principal language of Portuguese and a secondary language of Criollo backing it up, Cape Verde's culture has been formed by an ethnic mix of African and Portuguese. As the 9 inhabited islands are mostly barren and sometimes drought-stricken, the word verde seems an odd way of describing them. Charles Darwin visited in 1831 and felt that the barren and rocky landscape had a certain feeling of grandeur that more vegetation would have spoiled. During the 18th and 19th centuries, Cape Verde lost over 100,000 people to starvation due to droughts, and in some years as much as 40% of its population perished. The problem has not gone away in the 20th century. The Portuguese arrived at Cape Verde in 1456 and soon began importing slaves to work the vineyards and plantations. Wine brought prosperity from Portugal, which then attracted pirates. Much later, the islands became an important location for resupplying ships with coal, livestock, and water. A peaceful country with a flourishing democracy, Cape Verde has the highest health standards in all of West Africa and a fairly well-educated populace with a literacy rate of nearly 70%. Its city squares are shaped by prakas, bandstands, and cobbled streets, although most of its cab drivers seem to have been trained by NASA. The region's economy, however, is another story. More than half of Cape Verde's fishermen, for example, have left the islands for lack of work, and there are presently more Cape Verdeans living in the northeastern U.S. than in Cape Verde itself. More than 80% of the island's food supply is imported, yet somehow there's still a remarkably buoyant posture on Cape Verde, and each island gives off a small-town feeling. In the beautiful city of Mindelo, a visitor is led toward the home of a writer one moment, and then to the home of the island's most visible citizen, world-renowned singer Cesaria Evora the next. Cape Verde Islanders have poise and grace, yet one senses insularity and a certain degree of reticence toward outsiders, at least at first. Yet during the weeks preceding Mardi Gras or Carnival, a sea change takes place. This is the biggest event of the year. Rehearsals pulsate night and day, and young people seem to have little time for anything else. Some might say that Cape Verde isn't West Africa at all, yet the islands are linked to the mainland by much more than just a 2-hour plane ride from Dakar. Their historic connection to the slavery question and a shared ethnic lineage place West Africa and the Cape Verde Islands, despite pronounced differences, more inside the same universe than out. The story of West Africa is a human story. It isn't the story of bridges, temples, and art museums, because in a certain sense, there aren't any. There are few beautiful buildings, glorious vistas, and little congruity to West Africa in a conventional sense. Yet images from an African visit can linger on long after the dust has settled and the nervous system has returned to normal. Money changers stuffing wads of bills into a person's face at hectic border posts. Cab drivers handing over the keys to their cars in hopes of a fare. Frantic women trying to show a tourist how to make it through the border from Togo to Benin. Anything for a bite to eat. Armed border officials sleeping in hammocks for 2 hours while a traveler waits for his passport to be stamped. Small girls at rural bus stops rushing through crowds to return change that one has forgotten, or the same girls presenting one with a second orange that one neglected to pick up. African villagers traveling on the top of trucks as middle-class tourists pass in recreational vehicles. The Islamic call to prayer, heard all over West Africa. In Burkina Faso, a graduate student writing a thesis can find no information pertaining to Britain in his home country, so he must get on a bus and travel 20 hours to Accra, Ghana, all at his own expense. West Africans are living out a sad tale orchestrated by the haves and played out by the have-nots. Its history of slavery, tribal animosity, and mismanaged politics is not a pretty one. Western colonial powers bled Africa of its resources, but left little in return. While independence came as a breath of fresh air, Africa's post-colonial leaders have usually drifted off in the direction of self-destruction. Western aid programs have also failed. One such program in Mali taught people how to build wells in rural areas. It did not, however, instruct them on follow-up maintenance. After a few years, most of the wells deteriorated until most ended up being worthless. In other cases, irrigation schemes solved nothing, leaving villagers with little more than an increase in snail fever. Yet somehow, West Africans managed to stagger through, making the best of limited circumstances. Social and political change will be necessary on a grand scale in West Africa if the lives of most people are to change appreciably in the coming decades. In Dakar, Senegal, young boys carried caged birds in the streets, releasing them when given small tips. It's of course sad that people must resort to such things in order to survive. Yet somehow, it's also a nice image. Birds escaping the chains that bind them to fly onward. The chains that have shackled West Africa, both internal and external, won't be broken so easily. But the hope is there. One can only have faith that West Africa may begin turning the process around, and that a brighter future, indeed, may beckon.